coming up.
But now there's a second report from Global News that revealed that Justin Trudeau's cabinet minister, Randy Boissonnault, remained listed as a director of Global Health Imports Corporation, GHI, for over a year after his 2021 election.
So would you say that Russia, for example, Iran, are behind disinformation on social media, on platforms like TikTok, on platforms like YouTube, on platforms like Meta, in order to convince people to accept anti-Semitic tropes and disproportionate blame on Israel?
How can we already have, say, like cybersecurity teams? Where would the alert system or the independent commission of some sorts come into play? Who would they?
Is TikTok conditioning people?
Is that we had competing memes, competing ideologies that were passing out disinformation about cops, that all cops are bastards, and that democracy was a failed experiment in imperialism. And that was met with vigilante activity, right? And those two forces...
I would pause. I feel like you've now created a bit of a false equivalency between those, and these will be ideological positions. That
Mr. Green, I'm going to give you a little more time.
I remember somebody tweeted out back like 2018 or something about Colin Kaepernick getting an endorsement from Nike while Nike paid their workers only 20 cents. And that was Snopes then did a fact check on that. And they said, no, that was incorrect. Nike actually pays their employees 68 cents.
Because we have members that need to prepare for non-answer period. Mr. Fisher, go ahead.
I'm really concerned about the increasing prevalence and dangers of political leaders and politicians who they themselves participate and feed into the machine of online disinformation and conspiracy theories.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Thanks, Chair. At the top of my time, I'm going to give verbal notice of a motion. So I'm not moving the motion, but I'm going to give notice of it. And that'll give the opportunity for it to be received by the clerk, translated, and then distributed to members of the committee. And of course, the provisions of 48 hours would then be in effect before it could be moved.
Okay, verbal notice. Go ahead. I'm not stopping your time, Mr. Yep. Barrett. Go ahead.
So this week, Chair, Global News revealed two investigative pieces that they've been working on. The first is one that I mentioned yesterday. That's that a series of meetings between lobbyist Kristen Poon and high-level political staff across multiple federal departments aimed those meetings at securing $110 million in federal grants for the Edmonton International Airport. Now, these efforts occurred between 2021 and 2022 and involved Poon's connection to Justin Trudeau's cabinet minister, Randy Boissonnault, who represents Edmonton Centre. Now, Mr. Boissonnault, in transitioning from his consulting business to his ministerial role, delegated control of his business to Poon, who resumed his lobbying activities. Now, Mr. Boissonnault gave his former business partner his only client, which is the Edmonton Regional Airport Authority. The minister's influence, of course, is attached to that transfer. So this firm lobbied the Edmonton Airport Authority, an organization regulated by the government on federal government land with board members appointed by the government, the same government that Mr. Boissonnault is now a member of. And Mr. Boissonnault was collecting payments from the company that was lobbying his government. So this, of course, raises incredible concerns with respect to the Lobbying Act, but also the Conflict of Interest Act and the Conflict of Interest Code for members. But now there's a second report from Global News that revealed that Justin Trudeau's cabinet minister, Randy Boissonnault, remained listed as a director of Global Health Imports Corporation, GHI, for over a year after his 2021 election. Now, Mr. Boissonnault has claimed that he has no involvement with GHI since his election, but the company co-founded by Mr. Boissonnault in 2019 after his electoral defeat secured contracts totaling $8.2 million from other levels of government, provincial and municipal governments, for pandemic supplies. Now imagine the advantage of competing for government contracts against a company that had a member of Justin Trudeau's federal cabinet listed as one of the directors. And that's why such a scenario is in fact prohibited by law. Now, I would be remiss not to mention that GHI faced multiple lawsuits for unpaid bills, unfulfilled deliveries, resulting in default judgments totaling over $7.8 million. Allegations of fraud, wire fraud, were made against Mr. Boissonneau's GHI co-founder, Stephen Anderson, in one of the lawsuits. And despite winning lawsuits, suppliers struggled to recoup owed funds from Minister Boissonneau's company that he was still listed as a director for, GHL, raising questions about the legitimacy of its operation and the fairness of its bidding process. Chair, the motion is that pursuant to Standing Order 1083H and in light of new media reports, the committee undertake an immediate study into Minister Randy Boissonneau's allegations of fraud and contraventions of ethics and lobbying laws, that the committee invite Minister Randy Boissonneau, Kirsten Poon, Stephen Anderson of Global Health Imports, and the Ethics Commissioner to testify individually in addition to any other relevant witnesses, and that the committee report its findings to the House. Chair, I'd like to share the rest of my time with Mr. Veron, please.
Go ahead, Mr. Veron. So the motion is on notice. Go ahead, Mr. Veron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Particularly, Mr. Nemo, I would like to start with you. Just around the misinformation, disinformation, I like your influence operations deal. One of the challenges that I have seen is just around what goes and what doesn't go. It's not necessarily that it's wrong information, it's just that some things are promoted aggressively and other things that you would think that would become kind of viral don't become viral. So I'm just wondering if you have any kind of take on how can actors manipulate the thing, push things that go forward and push things that don't, or and repress things that should probably go forward.
In 45 seconds, Mr. Nemo, thank you.
Sure. I'd actually pick up on a point that Mr. Karma made, that something we have regularly seen, something I have seen in many different roles, is influence operations will try and land their content in front of a particular influencer or celebrity or politician in the hope that they will then amplify it themselves. And so to Mr. Karma's point, there is a real need for great caution by all of us. Every one of you in the room is a celebrity in your own way. There's a need for great caution because quite often threat actors will not try and land something directly in front of a viral audience. They will try it and land it in front of some kind of springboard. And anyone who has a social media following is that potential springboard. And that can be the way in which things break out.
Okay,
and so hence the need for the kind of resilience and care.
Thank you, Mr. Nemo and Mr. Veron. Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Nemo, just a short question. Do you know whether Meta uses its algorithms to amplify hateful posts in order to monetize the platform?
Mr. Housefather, I'm not sure if the committee are aware I no longer work at Meta. I have not worked there for a couple of months. When I was working there, I was a threat investigator specializing in influence operations. I do not know about the ins and outs of the algorithmic methods there.
Fair enough. I wasn't sure if your non-disclosure would prevent you answering that either, but I was just wondering, because we've had Meta witnesses before and they haven't exactly been forthcoming. Mr. Finkelstein, I'm going to turn to you. I'm familiar with a lot of the work that you've done, and some of the work that you've done that is the most impressive relates to anti-Semitism and how anti-Semitic tropes are spread on social media and how misinformation is fed from social media and then amplified to the extent that it comes out in the real world. Can you give us some examples of that?
I wouldn't even know where to start. I think that the problem has become so prolific. And look, I think that there are historical reasons that's true. I think that there is a way in which anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews is a fairly high-octane hate. It's very, very powerful. And it has a 1,000-year history, or 3,000-year history, or whatever, to draw upon in order to inform critics and people who are looking for something to blame. Now, one of the things that we discussed earlier is that in the current information environment, it's so complex that the people who win are the ones who are most successful at playing the blame game. And when that happens, the groups that have historically been best at receiving that blame end up being highlighted. So it's not different than other forms of hate. It's just far more elaborate, robust, and systemic. I think that a lot of what we're seeing now is unusual, and there's an anomalous rise in anti-Semitism. This has been drafted deliberately. There have been efforts going back to the Soviet Union and to others to agitate for a blood libel in the United Nations and other places to accuse Israel of genocide, to say that what's happening in Israel amounts to grotesque violations of human rights that don't occur elsewhere and that are unique to the Jewish people and to Israel, to one and only one nation. So the way that that's been amplified across college campuses in the face of recent aggressions in Israel has led to spill out that definitely we know that these signals start online and they forward predict anti-Semitism, right? So it's not just that the systems exist in and of themselves. We know that where we see the strengthening of these blood libels and of the highly high velocity political language, that is where the geographic signature of that language will predict where anti-Semitic attacks take place. The temporal signature of that information will predict when they take place, and not the other way around. So we know that the social media signal is carrying something that is potentially instructive. Okay, that's what's important to understand about this dynamic. It's highly manufactured by enemy nations. It's perfect for creating blame and uncertainty in already fraught societies. And so the result is we see that being pushed on very deliberatively by the CCP, very deliberatively by enemies of democracy, because they know it's going to be successful.
So would you say that Russia, for example, Iran, are behind disinformation on social media, on platforms like TikTok, on platforms like YouTube, on platforms like Meta, in order to convince people to accept anti-Semitic tropes and disproportionate blame on Israel?
Very famously, the Soviet it wasn't called the GRU at the time, but they had a swastika campaign in the 70s in Europe. And they decided they would paint swastikas everywhere. And this goes to Ben's point about successful versus unsuccessful disinformation operations and what characterizes signal and what characterizes noise. Oftentimes, what becomes signal is concern about noise, right? That what happened in Europe was that 70 swastikas were put up by GRU members. That's all it took. That's all it took for people to start becoming convinced that everybody else was hateful. That's all it took. And once they were convinced that everybody else was hateful, they started blooming up organically. So you have a catalytic process whereby people are oftentimes initially, what's happened in social media is the growth of what we call false polarization. We're told that the other side has become so radical. Don't believe it. It's not true. Consistently, when we poll on people to understand what their positions are, what we learn is that we have far more consensus on virtually any issue than what is depicted on social media. So we're being fed a conflict. And in that environment, the suspicion of being undermined by a fifth column, or the suspicion of having your control taken out from under you, being sold on that conflict, that's where it becomes so important to say, hey guys, this is a small signal. It's not that important. But when there's no one trusted to be able to say that, all the suspicions, they have fuel to become fire very, very quickly.
Do I have any time, Mr. Chair?
So
I have one tiny question, Mr. Finkelstein. So based on all the data that you are talking about, that these investigations that you're doing and others are doing are providing, how do parliamentarians reliably obtain this type of data? How do we close the gap between what you know and what we know?
I said in the podcast that we were talking about earlier that I really feel that what's needed for democracies is a rapid investigatory function to be able to decide to help really visualize the difference. Because look, imagine, let's go back to Europe. Let's do the experiment. 70 GRU people are caught putting up swastikas. Instead of everyone doing it, the headline is, hey guys, this is 70 people and we're not as bad as we suspect each other of being. That becomes the headline. That is the headline. We aren't bad people. Right, we're being presented with complexity we've never had to deal with before, right? And that explains a lot of our bad behaviors and bad choices.
Thank you.
But ultimately, when people are aligned, it's definitely possible for us to have sensible, common sense, and consensus-driven conversations that are productive, as long as we have the capacity to separate out signal from noise.
Thank you, Mr. Finkelstein. I'm finding it difficult to cut you off. I find the information that you're providing fascinating.
High-level recommendations within 3 minutes that he could provide to this committee for the good and welfare of our report.
I would sort of agree with Mr. Finkelstein on the question of having an investigatory capacity. I think that's important. But I think more broadly, it's really looking at the offices of Parliament and thinking about how to protect your ability as parliamentarians to ensure that what you're working with as your ground truth is based on fact. And how to do that, how to train your staff, how to build their capacity to be resilient so that everyone who then interacts with you, whether it's your constituents or others, knows that you're a trusted source, at least. I'm not talking about your policy positions. I'm talking about the ground truth that you're using to make decisions. So I think parliamentary staff, I think they're going to be more targeted by these technologies such as deepfake videos and manipulated voices and those sorts of things. And then the other piece is, how are you going to protect the body of Canadian society that are your constituents? And how are you going to protect sort of next generations? And I think this is why I was suggesting a Canadian Charter of Digital Rights and Freedoms that outlined both the responsibilities and protections of Canadian citizens. I know that there's been a lot on the Online Harms Act, but I don't think it clarifies to citizens what their responsibilities are and what protections may be available to them. And so I'll stop there because I know we have a limited time, but thank you very much for that question. Have
you, or could you hypothetically comment on what might look like accountability for those that surreptitiously use these models, algorithms, platforms for nefarious use?
Well, I would say there are two cases that I brought up to the Parliament for this reason. The first is that you have bad actors who exist in closet spaces and basements, who are capable of upending and causing mayhem and murder at massive scales opportunistically, right? So we need complete visibility of where those actors are. We need an alert system that can bring that information to lawmakers before they even know to ask for it. And to create a scouting capacity for understanding where these emerging threats are happening so that they can be managed before they spill out into the real world, right? That means that we need complete platform access. We need to have the same access platforms do without running the risk of privacy.
Just for the record, with the last 20 seconds, I think you had suggested it being arm's length from the governments, that
yes.
We're not talking about
Crucial.
a big brother model, or we're
Absolutely.
not talking about potentially authoritarian capture, but an independent commission that would have, is that just for clarity?
100%. We can't, if I had to tell a democratic public that their government was responsible for managing all of their information, count me out. I mean, I'm sure that I can imagine citizens not reacting well to that for good reason. Okay. So I think having independence is really crucial. And the reason that's true is because it's just like a referee, right? You need someone to blame, and that person has to be willing to wear the stripes and willing to be blamed.
So I've been listening very carefully. Time has run out from a number of members who had asked you some questions. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a runway. Is there any additional thoughts based on previous questions put to you by my colleagues, sir, that you would like to complete your thoughts on?
I have too many of them.
Well, perhaps in the vein of the most, in my perspective, in my opinion, the most important question was put to you by Matthew Green in terms of recommendations, whether they be policy or legislative recommendations, because at the end of the day, at the conclusion of this particular study, it's a mandate of us to actually report to the House of Commons. So we look to the experts in the field.
I'll speak specifically about what a blue sky. Look, it's not a blue sky. I think this is. The platform that needs to be constructed for democracies isn't some faint ideal that we ought to do. It's increasingly clear to me that the lack of this organ comprises a national security crisis. That absent the ability to make sober determinations about how democracies are being manipulated, it's creating an escape velocity for those manipulations because it's disrupting the function of democracy faster than democracy can manage that dysfunction. This is a cat and mouse game. And so what's needed is a civic network to be instantiated rapidly. This is not needed, as an idea that has to happen at some point because it would be nice. It was needed years ago. This function was needed years ago. Okay, and the goal is to step into the hardest conversations. Now, the thing about very hard conversations is that we're so concerned about them, and yet the conflict is all people tend to look at. The conflict, when it's had honestly, is the solution to the problem. Right? The conflict is the solution. So when you've structured an investigative capacity that's manned by people who are credible as good faith actors for trying to create the most honest representation of the conflict they can create, and they're feeding that forward so we can distinguish between what's noise and what's signal here. How bad is this? Let's talk to the people who really believe, who are on the other side. Let's understand what they really think about this, right? That's going to be an urgent thing for law enforcement to know. It's going to be an urgent thing for understanding who is really in support of our constitutions, who's really in support of the threads and the fibers that hold together our civic bonds of trust, and who are people who are seeking to deliberately undermine them. Understanding the difference between those kinds of narratives is absolutely crucial for the functioning of democracy.
I think parliamentarians need to understand what does resilience mean, and they have to have an understanding of what you're building resilience to. You have to look at Canada's strategic industries. How might mis and disinformation be used to disrupt our agri-food system, food security, national energy policy and net resilience and networks there. Of course, election security. I think you have to look at what do our adversaries want to do to disrupt our ability to meet our own needs as well as the needs of our export markets and those sorts of things. I think there needs to be a strategic piece here that protects the Canadian economy, and I think there's a profound economic aspect to this that also needs to be looked at. And this committee does need to understand that resiliency is not infinite. What doesn't kill you sometimes does not make you stronger. Sometimes it weakens you, and the pandemic has weakened Canada. It's weakened our health status. And in national security terms, the status of the health and mental health and resilience of each individual is seen to be the biggest defense against mis and disinformation. That's in that doctrine. It's been the mental health and cognitive capacity of each Canadian to figure out how to act in the face of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brock.
How can we already have, say, like cybersecurity teams? Where would the alert system or the independent commission of some sorts come into play? Who would they alert? Would it be the social media platform providers or
it's a great question.
Expand on that.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So let me just say that, I'm a neuroscientist by training. I finished my PhD at Princeton and was studying animals in virtual reality to reverse engineer how their brains work using laser beams. So I was not really bred in the world of intelligence. But I found that understanding how the brain works is really helpful for understanding the intelligence process. And I now train analysts to join the FBI or CIA at Rutgers, where I teach courses on threat analysis for the advanced courses at the Miller Center for Secure Communities. Right. So what I found in that process is that when it comes to what it is we do and how to create a kind of alert function on it, it really requires that we designate the category of threat that we're talking about in ways that give it a clear kind of set of parameters. Really, what we're looking at is not just cybersecurity, it's social cybersecurity. Okay, so social cybersecurity is really what we train in. And the threats that pertains to are any threat that could possibly afflict a vulnerable community or democracy. And I can give you some examples from NCRI's research just as how wide-standing that could be. This could be computer-generated hoaxes and malicious information in the wakes of mass shootings. It could be Spanish alt-right networks glorifying Crusader memes. It could be bot-driven gold rushes and inauthentic social media on crypto, Right.
But the objective is to mobilize people, right? So that's it intersects. Both things intersect. What you're talking about.
Well, they do, and what they're showing is where the social risks are accumulating in ways the institutions can't keep up, and wherever that's happening, there needs to be an investigatory function that acts as a support system to democracy.
So maybe talk about what would the framework around that be? What would
the framework would be to endow and create protections for an independent entity to be able to be permitted to amass data, especially from social media, but other forms of database aggregation. This would create essentially a fusion center, and it would be able to look at social cyber risks. These are risks about invasive ideologies from hostile nations invading our universities to across the board. It needs the capacity that's usually resolved for intelligence agencies, but in ways that allow it to be aligned psychologically, aligned clinically with democracies that they're protecting, and that it needs protections from those democracies in order to do its job. Right? So that's really the process, is create a fusion center capacity with individuals who are reputable within the societies in question, aligned with the societies in question, and who show clear evidence of cooperative antagonism, adversarial relationships that are brought inside, not outside. Right, in order to be credible to the vast majority of citizens.
I'd like to give Mr. Khanna a little bit of time to just expand on if he has anything to add.
Very, very quick amount of time, sir.
Again, I'm going to get back to what is the resiliency that we need to protect for Canada and Canadians, and how are you going to support the Houses of Parliament and citizens to be clearer about how they protect themselves from these sorts of risks. And
so there's an education piece there.
I think there's an education piece, but I think there's also a rights framework that needs to be there as well.
Thank you, sir.
Is TikTok conditioning people?
Yeah. I mean, the data that we have, and this is unpublished, but the data that we have on this is very convincing that's the case. I won't get into all the details, but what we see is that there is an anomalous level of belief in authoritarian ideology that's prevalent in TikTok users. That is not as present in other platforms. There's an anomalous level of anti-Semitism, anomalous levels of...
Would it be reasonable then to think that information on gender identity questions could result from a TikTok campaign to cause chaos?
Well, I don't know about that subject specifically because I haven't researched it, but it's certainly possible that you see a lot of whenever you see polarizing issues, and the trans issue, whatever else is true, is definitely an issue that I think speaks to many people in ways that are quite urgent. You always have the capacity for misrepresentation and bad faith conflict, right? And that creates an attention scheme. So it creates a scheme to capture attention on both sides of that issue. Right, so you have a process that should be, I think, fairly sober, medicalized, and serious. Becomes something that's highly hyper politicized, right? And that's a feature of social media, writ large. So I wouldn't be surprised to find, vast anti-trans campaigns parading around these places that are speaking to different adversarial groups, or even other kind of hyper ideological gender activism that on the other side of that's affiliated with revolutionary ideology and all the rest of it. So that's an example of how what should be a sober, serious conversation, that is not pleasant for the people that are involved in it, I'm sure, becomes something that primarily assumes the responsibility of a public spectacle.
Could we presume that disinformation could become a military tool?
There's no presumption needed. This is used widely and by state actors to cause disruption. Okay, it's too bad Mr. Nemo is no longer here because that's his specialty.
Okay.
I've heard you say repeatedly that there's an anomalous impact by TikTok, but yet I think it's fair to say that the culture wars certainly began long before the invent of TikTok, long before the invent of social media. That culture wars have always been a primary factor used by political operatives to create wedges, to create division, and to, as you pointed out, find somebody to blame. Is that fair to say?
Oh, 100%. Starting with the printing press. Absolutely.
And going back to, I think about the Edward Bernays Century of Self documentary that outlined the way in which propaganda is used interchangeably between corporate interests and government interests, that state propaganda is used universally by all state actors. Is that fair to say?
Actually, it's even worse than that. You guys have probably heard of places like 4chan and 8chan, these kinds of nasty white supremacist communities. We did an analysis of who's influencing who, Russian propaganda or 4chan. Yeah, they're getting it from the kids in their basements, guys. Yeah, like they're literally picking it up from the white supremacists hanging out in their basements. They're not that creative, but those kids are, and the state sees on that and use it.
Sure, but there's also non-state actors, right? Like there's ideological movements that are religious. That is not unique to any one religion. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Every religion has its fanatics.
Right, and so when dealing with these topics, when we're looking for solutions, would it not be responsible for us to deal with the entire structure rather than zeroing in on one ideology or one extreme?
It's crucial, and one of the things that's come out in our research is a phenomena that I term reciprocal radicalization. When we look at the events that occur in the United States, the riots that occurred during the George Floyd protests and the January 6th events, we aren't really seeing two separate events. We're seeing one event. What happened online was that we had competing memes, competing ideologies that were passing out disinformation about cops, that all cops are bastards, and that democracy was a failed experiment in imperialism. And that was met with vigilante activity, right? And those two forces,
I would pause. I feel like you've now created a bit of a false equivalency between those, and these will be ideological positions.
Mr. Green, I'm going to give you a little more time. Sorry, sir. Your time's up. I'm going to give you a little more time at the end.
Sure,
you and Mr. Villemure. Mr. Veron for 3 minutes. Go ahead.
I'm fascinated by this discussion, and I just was wondering. We seem to be looking for an arbiter somewhere along the line, and I'm just, I guess I question what would that system look like? Like I remember somebody tweeted out back like 2018 or something about Colin Kaepernick getting an endorsement from Nike while Nike paid their workers only 20 cents, and that was Snopes then did a fact check on that, and they said no, that was incorrect. Nike actually pays their employees 68 cents per hour, which regardless was still ridiculous, right? Like the point was still made, but the Snopes said no, it's an incorrect statement. How do we manage that? And like, who do we get to, like, how do we build a trusted entity? Because I think Snopes lost a lot of credibility when they said that. I think you're right. Yeah. Continue.
So I'll go back to something I said that I really want to get back to speaking with MP Green, because I think he raised an important point that I want to address. But really quickly, what I'll say is that's why I think that the importance is sometimes on what the exact facts are, but oftentimes where the disinformation is really powerful, it's not actually about the facts per se. It's really about the nature of the conflict and misrepresenting how bad the conflict really is, right? So when we do a good job of understanding what the conflict is and we present that and people say, yes, that is what the conflict is. That is what it's about. Right. Yes. You're not mischaracterizing my position. This is really what I think.
Who is the arbiter? Like, how do you bring... You seem to...
Ideally, you bring the people themselves. Ideally, you're surveying people themselves to capture that, and you're also looking at online behavior. And there's usually a dissociation gap between those things. That distance is where false polarization comes in. It's distrust that's usually unwarranted. It's almost always what's being sold.
Who brings those... Like, that's the trouble. Who brings those actors together? Who is the arbiter?
I think that the body that has to deliberate this has to be made up of credible adversaries, of people that do disagree and disagree on axes that represent popular conflicts. And that has to be believable to the people to most of the people who hold those views. They have to be able to say, yes, this is my guy. This is really what I believe. This is really what I find this person compelling.
And how do you deal with the perceived platforming of perhaps nefarious characters?
Very, very quick response, please.
Yeah. what I would say to that is that we're not going to be able to. We're not, aside from we have to have a process for arriving at who meets the criteria of both being somebody who holds a fairly polar position, but also being an adult in the room.
Okay, thank you.
And it's not always easy to make that distinction, but if you're transparent about how you've made it, you've done the best you can in bridging that so that you can earn people's trust. We have to earn that. It's not just going to be given or dictated or legislated.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Fisher for 3, and then we're going to have to cut it down to 2 minutes each, Monsieur Villemure and Mr. Green, because we have members that need to prepare for non-answer period. Mr. Fisher, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. I'm really concerned about the increasing prevalence and dangers of political leaders and politicians who they themselves participate and feed into the machine of online disinformation and conspiracy theories. Mr. Finkelstein, I'll ask you 2 quick questions, and there's a very short amount of time, but if there's any spare time, we'll go to Mr. Khanna. One is, how can politicians and people in the public sphere protect themselves against potential threats and violence driven by online information? And 2, what responsibility do politicians have to ensure that they're not fanning the flames that lead to potential threats and real-world danger?
Yeah. Okay. That's really good. Yeah. So I would say that the way that we shore up, the way that we can shore up resilience in the face of information threats is about the creation of transparency wherever that's possible, and the lawmakers that work towards that and creating greater transparency in their decision-making processes and the data that they're using to make decisions, and showcasing that so that how you come to this conclusion is evident for anyone who wants to see it. And getting better data, being responsible about being a steward of data so that you can become better informed. The more you do that, I think that's the key to earning trust in this age. Because people may disagree with you, but if what they find when they penetrate is that they have good reasons to understand that you're making a good faith effort, it forgives a lot. Going back to what Mr. Green said, he said we have ideological differences. I'm not talking about the BLM movement. We found out that the violence that took place in the summer was statistically, geographically, at a different set of parameters than the BLM mobilizations themselves. These were a fringe group of anti-government activists and anti-police activists that were espousing not just anti-police ideas, that it's okay to not think that policing is good and needs reform. These were people who are calling for a complete revolution, the murder of officials. It's those people that we need to be able to say, hey, I agree with you that we need more social justice. I agree with you that racism is bad. But this is out. This part of it I'm not in for, right? So being able to make those distinctions is really important, because we don't want to create hostilities and around a basis of the belief that somebody's more polarized than they really are. Because when we drill down into it, it's amazing how much we have in common. That's the kind of hidden truth that comes out beyond the social media and the hype. It's amazing how much consensus there is.
Mr. Khanna, do you want to touch on that? Thank you, Mr. Finkelstein.
I mean, I think to some extent this goes back to how we debate really tough issues and what example we set on resolving conflicts, setting policy agendas, and the children are watching, the youth are watching, and this is also what the fuel is for dis and misinformation, particularly from state and non-state actors that want to influence us. If they're looking at certain divisions that they can exploit within the House of Commons, they will work hard to do that, and that's what I'm sort of most worried about.
Thank you, sir.
Simple question for Mr. Finkelstein. We talked a lot about social media platforms, but if we go beyond that, what is the role played by companies like Palantir in disinformation? Okay,
so you're asking what role specialized intelligence companies have in. Are you asking? You might be asking one of two things. You might be asking what role do private companies have in creating more resilience against disinformation, or you might be asking, is it possible that companies that are expert in disinformation actually go out of bounds and create problems? Which one of those questions are you asking?
The second.
Okay. This is something that we have dealt with and we in very high profile ways with other organizations that are in the disinformation space. Disinformation actually is a word I tend not to like because I think people have different opinions of what is and isn't disinformation that are fairly polarizing. But we have called out in very high profile cases that affiliations between quote unquote disinformation groups and people that have revolutionary and anti-government ideologies. At the front page of the LA Times, we've been on the record, speaking about that problem. So my sense is that there is a challenge you have with groups with private groups who but oftentimes those groups will lose credibility. What happens is that when you do play into an ideological game, people can tell that. They can often tell that and then that's true because you'll have one side of the party pick their disinformation expert, and you'll have the other side of the party pick their disinformation expert, right? So now you have competing experts that are talking about you're the disinformation agent, no, you're the disinformation agent, and this is part of the signal that we need to be promoting. So we just got a $4 million grant at Rutgers University to create a civic infrastructure to promote positive messages about civility online with these tools.
Thank you.
Right, and how do we create forward messages that promote democratic values? Right, not just playing gotcha, but actually promoting the democratic values that people need to engage in as a solution to the problems they have.
Thank you, sir.
Right, so big.
Sorry, Mr. Finkelstein. Mr. Green, 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to shift from the digital disinformation to the analog, the traditional disinformation, the ways in which information is perpetrated that fuel the atrocities that are being committed around the world. Yeah. I referenced the quoting of President Joe Biden on 40 beheaded babies, right? Like just this horrible, atrocious dehumanization in the pretext to the incursions into Ras and other places. Without having to get into specificity about that, can each of you just comment briefly on the ways in which traditional analog channels for misinformation and disinformation are also part of an ecosystem that are then catapulted into the universe online and in other spaces? Mr. Canna, perhaps, and then Mr. Finkelstein.
I don't have a lot to say about that except to note that the integrated approaches are the most effective. If you see something online and then you see an analog in the real world that confirms that opinion, or it's suggested to you that things in the actual physical world based on an online campaign are reflecting your beliefs online, then that's going to be another vector, a confirmation in physical space for potentially some pretty malign opinions. And so what I think is interesting is how sophisticated people are about looking at that confluence. And I'll now hand it over to Dr. Finkelstein.
Yeah, I think we call that, when I teach my students about this, I call it atrocity pornography. Mm-hmm. That there's a way in which you're seeking confirmation for pre-existing biases. Now, why do people do that? People did that long before social media. And the reason they do that is because of uncertainty. When you're faced with uncertainty, it matters a lot less what the truth is, and it matters a lot more what mob you're with. Okay. And because the thing about mobs is that they're very effective at creating the truth on the ground. Who cares about what the truth is? Me and my mob will tell you what the truth is. Okay, so
just for the purpose of the study, can you just quickly define mob before my time runs out?
Well, your time has run out, but I'm going to allow him to define that. Go ahead.
Psychologically speaking, what a mob is a mass of people who are policing moral uniformity at the cost of policing in-group loyalty to authority, and doing that at the expense of critical thinking. In order to police specific outcomes in the world, it often involves a punitive orientation towards people that you disagree with, and as part of the psychological characteristic of both left and right-wing authoritarianism. Okay, so those are the psychological features of mobs.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr.
Very
Green.
helpful.
Okay,
looking forward to the podcast. Appreciate it.
So that concludes the panel for today.